Some people think enrolling in a course is the best way to learn Chinese, but others say that courses are useless and swear by the effectiveness of self-studying. So should you enroll in a Chinese course, or are you better off learning on your own? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to explore the question of whether or not you should enroll in a Chinese course and what the alternative might be. Among other things, we are going to talk about the pros and cons of enrolling in formal courses, and we're also going to look at how we can mitigate some of the problems with formal courses, as well, of course, look at the alternative, which is to study on your own. The default approach is to take a course, which I think most people do, but if you read online and you discuss language learning with people, you will soon come across people who claim that classroom learning is useless and that studying on your own is the only way to really make progress quickly. An extreme case of this is that you might have heard someone who say that they've studied Chinese for 6 years in school and they still can't really speak the language. Or maybe you heard someone who claims that they've become fluent in Chinese in just a few months by studying on their own. Let's begin by stating the fairly obvious, and that is that both approaches can work. If someone says that you can't learn Chinese in a formal educational setting, they are clearly wrong, and if someone says that you have to take courses to get good at Chinese, then they are also wrong. How much you learn is largely determined by how much time you spend engaging with the language, and you can do that both inside and outside of a classroom. For most people, the best solution is going to be a mix of the two, and exactly how much of each and what you should consider when you choose, for example, which course to take or how to study on your own is dependent on your personality, the environment in which you are learning, and of course your goals for learning Chinese in the first place. To find the best solution for you, we are now going to look at the benefits of enrolling in a Chinese course, and I will deliberately focus on the positive aspects first, and after that we will go through the same points and see why they might sometimes not actually be benefits after all. So first out is access to guidance and structure. This is something which is particularly useful for beginners because a course is thought out by someone who has a lot of experience with the language and teaching the language, and the curriculum is built in a certain way for a certain reason, and that is much more likely to work than something that you come up with on your own if you haven't learned Chinese before. And if you have learned Chinese before, you're no longer a beginner, so it doesn't really apply. Naturally, the more advanced you get, the less you need support and structure from other people, and you can make your own curriculum, as it were. But if you are a beginner, taking a course can be good because it provides you with guidance and structure. And of course, it's nice to be able to choose things on your own and choose your own learning materials and so on and so forth. But as a beginner or even an intermediate learner, it is sometimes hard to find learning materials and you can't really evaluate them yourself. And it's just that more choice isn't necessarily a good thing. And it's also worth considering that all the research you put into this, when you search for materials, learning methods and all that, is often time that is spent in English because your Chinese is not good enough to look anything of this up in Chinese, so you will spend an awful lot of time on things that don't actually advance your Chinese at all. Compare this with going with a pre-made curriculum or a curriculum that's made by a teacher or an institution, which has been thought out by someone else. And even if it doesn't suit you perfectly, it's still something you can just use and follow without spending hours and hours researching yourself. Here I have tried to create a solution that is kind of in between, and it is my course Unlocking Chinese, the ultimate guide for beginners, which is aimed specifically at people who need to get started, so it contains basic things about the Chinese language, but also basic things about how to learn it. But this obviously only covers the beginner case, and it's also something where you have to be fairly active yourself, so it's not like a traditional course. Benefit number 2 is listening and reading on your level. And providing that you're taking a course that's aimed at your level, your teacher and your learning materials will present Chinese spoken and written, which are adjusted to your level, meaning that you can make sense of it and that it is ideal for your learning. This is also a benefit that is more important for beginners, because as a beginner it is extremely difficult to evaluate how easy or how hard something is, and it could be that something you find online or someone else recommends to you simply is too hard for you and that you would have been better off using something else. And if you are in a classroom with a teacher who's used to teaching this level, they know what you know, they can talk to you in a language that you can understand, and you can do much more with the language that you have compared with if you choose random resources you find online. I have spent a lot of time trying to find resources that are suitable for beginners, and even I find it difficult. And that means that you, as a learner, are unlikely to stumble upon something that is better than something that is tailored for you specifically. So, over to benefit number 3, which is feedback, corrections, and answers to your questions. So having access to a teacher and a course means that you will get feedback of various kinds. Maybe you have hand-in assignments, maybe you have pronunciation practice, or you just have someone who can answer your questions if you run into a grammar problem you don't understand, or you just don't get it when it comes to characters or something. You can ask your teacher and you don't need to spend hours online trying to search for your answer, and even if you find something online, it might not even be right. And this is something I think is very important. You do need feedback in some areas, for example, when it comes to pronunciation. Maybe you don't need feedback on everything all the time, and it doesn't have to be explicit in the sense that someone tells you what you're doing wrong, but you do need verification that your basic pronunciation is solid, because otherwise it's perfectly possible to study Chinese for years without being aware of certain mistakes. And these mistakes can be quite major without anybody correcting you. This is not only true for beginners. If you're looking to improve your Chinese writing, for example, it can be very helpful to have a course that's structured towards that and a teacher who can help you out and give you feedback. Now over to benefit number 4, which is a high bar for minimum effort. And this is what I feel to be one of the most important reasons to take a course, mainly because most people simply struggle to invest the necessary time and effort if they don't have any external pressure at all. To know if this applies to you, you really have to know yourself. You maybe have tried to learn something on your own before. But I must say that even as someone who is by many people regarded to be fairly self-disciplined and having a fair amount of grit, I benefit immensely from taking courses, especially over the long term, because even if I might feel very motivated to do something for a few weeks or even a few months, enrolling in a course makes sure that I stay committed for at least a full semester or maybe even longer if it is a program. Learning environment matters greatly here, so if you are in an environment where everybody speaks Chinese and you're very motivated to learn, then taking a course might not be necessary. You have everything you need. But if you're studying Chinese in your home country and you have to seek out opportunities to learn deliberately, that means that when motivation flags, which it will inevitably do, at least periodically, you will simply learn less because there are so many other things that distract you and other things you can spend your time on. Naturally, enrolling in a course doesn't mean you can't learn on your own as well, it just means that the minimum effort required is higher. The maximum amount of effort is of course the same in both situations, it doesn't really change that. Benefit number 5 is supportive environment for learning. And the classroom can be a very nice environment to learn. It's a safe place where you can try things out, where you can experiment, and people are largely understanding of your status as a second language learner who can't really say everything yet. It's also great to have people to study alongside with. You can team up with them for moral support or for sharing tips and tricks and so on. And simply just being accountable and being in a group of other people instead of on your own can be very helpful as well. Another benefit of having classmates is that if they don't speak your language or if you commit to speaking only Chinese, this is a very authentic way of using basic Chinese to communicate about things that you have in common, something that can be rather difficult with native speakers, whom you have very little in common with, and who might speak using language that you haven't encountered yet and simply find too difficult. The 6th and final benefit is credits to prove what you have learned. This can just feel good, or it can be a requirement to reach something else that you're striving for. So for example, if you're going to teach Chinese, maybe you do have to have a certain number of credits, or it might be required for some job application or other. Now, in many situations, you might be able to use a proficiency test such as the HSK or TOCFL instead of credits, but this is not always possible. There are also situations where credits are needed, such as when you're taking a scholarship, you need to prove that you've learned a certain amount of things, and then of course you have to enroll in a course. But the usefulness of credits depends of course what credits they are and what you plan to use them for. I have personally studied several courses that I took mostly to get credits actually, not primarily to learn Chinese. Well, I also learned Chinese along the way, but that was not my main reason. If I had chosen regardless of credits, I would probably have studied on my own in these cases. It should be clear by now that I think that taking a course can be great for learning Chinese, and I owe a lot of my Chinese from the teachers I've had and the classmates I've studied alongside with. This brings us back to the sentiment I mentioned earlier about having studied Chinese in school for 6 years without being able to do much in the language. And I think it's worth stopping a few minutes to talk about this because it's something I hear a lot, and there are some very simple reasons that this happens, and it might not actually be related to taking a course or studying on your own at all. It goes without saying that a bad course is obviously not as good for you, and if you don't invest in necessary time and energy into the course, then maybe not learning that much is not entirely the course's fault. It could also be completely unrelated to any of this and simply be a maths problem. To show you what I mean, let's say that we have person A who studies full-time, and we're talking about a serious student here who studies full-time, but not a maniac who studies every waking hour. That means that if you study for full-time for say 3 months, you will rack up something like 500 hours. That's a little bit more than 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day, not weekends, but I think that's not unreasonable if you are studying full-time and doing nothing else. Naturally, if you are a maniac and studies a lot, you can maybe even double that and get 1,000 hours in 3 months, although that is a little bit extreme. Now, let's compare this with what happens in school, and I'm talking about pre-university here, or sometimes if you have Chinese at university, but it's kind of an elective or an extra thing you're doing. You might now be studying just a few hours a week, maybe 2-3 hours of class and 1 or 2 hours of homework or some studying on your own. If we then take term duration and breaks and so on into account, that means that in a year you will be able to study something like 160 hours. That's 4 hours a week for 40 weeks. So if we compare these two situations, we will see that the full-time student will be able to study as much in 3 months as the other person does in 3 years. If the full-time student is really dedicated and does little else beyond learning Chinese, they might learn as much in 3 months as the normal student does in 6 years. So really, someone who says that they didn't learn much language in school, it doesn't really mean that going to school was the main reason. Maybe it was that you simply didn't invest enough time, or that the course was bad, or both. And this of course explains why most people are dissatisfied with how they learned languages in school, and then when they learn languages on their own, they figure out, oh, this is so much more efficient, and they look back and they compare and see, oh, I learned as much in 3 months as I did in 6 years in school. Hence, it must be more efficient to learn on my own. Which is not really the case. Well, it could be the case, but it's certainly not a given. The key takeaway here is that it doesn't matter how many years ago you started learning, that's not what determines how much you learn. Instead, it is how many hours and minutes you spend engaging with the language, and if that is more concentrated, well, you will advance more quickly, and if that is very, very spread out, then you might not learn very much. Okay, so far I've only talked about why going to class might be very useful, and I've listed several benefits of taking a course. But now it's time to put this into perspective and look at some of the possible downsides of these. So first I will go through the same list again and comment on each item and say why it might actually not be such a big benefit after all, and then I will also add some downsides to taking a course that I haven't mentioned so far. The first benefit was access to guidance and structure. But it is possible that the structure and guidance you get is not actually what you need. You can't just enroll in a course and then assume that it will give you everything you want. If that were the case and all courses provided exactly what students needed, Hacking Chinese wouldn't exist and you probably wouldn't be listening to this podcast either. The sad truth here is that most courses do provide you with a structure, but it might not be the one you want. In the end, you are the one who's learning and you need to take responsibility for your own learning, and this is true even if you are in a program. Benefit number 2 was listening and reading on your level, and this is something where courses really do excel in most cases, but not all. The problem here is really that teachers might not provide you with this enough, and that textbooks really don't do it either. Even worse, if you're a beginner, many courses teach these things in English, so instead of providing you with lots of input that you can make sense of, they will explain things in English, and you learn a lot about the language, but not in the language. Lessons might be spent with text, trying to translate them, trying to analyze the grammar in them, and these things are done in English. Again, this is a problem that becomes less severe the more advanced you get, but you shouldn't count on it, and it also, of course, depends a lot on what the educational system is like in the country where you study. Benefit number 3 was feedback, corrections, and answers. And again, this is not something you can just count on. For example, if your pronunciation is off, say you've misunderstood how the third tone is pronounced, that's something that can go on for many years without anybody pointing anything out to you, even if you have several different teachers. This could be because your teacher has too much to do, there are too many other people in your class who have worse problems than you do, Or it could be that they have encountered other students who were very sensitive and took it badly when mistakes were pointed out. Another thing that's worth considering is that maybe all the questions that you discuss with your teacher, especially if you do it in English, might not actually be that beneficial for you. For example, it's common for beginners to spend a lot of time to try to figure out the difference between certain words such as 可以, 能, and 会. And they usually do this in English either by asking their teacher or maybe by searching online. But maybe it could be that you're better off spending all that time reading more and then gradually getting a feel for these and then looking it up when you're actually ready to start using these in an appropriate way. Finally, we shouldn't forget that there is a possibility that the answer you get from your teacher is actually wrong. And this is something we discussed in episode 27, which was titled 7 Things You Were Taught in Chinese Class That Are Actually Wrong. The fourth benefit was about a high bar for minimum effort, but this is of course only true if you find a course that is exactly at the right level. You know, if you aim for the stars, maybe you will end up on the moon, that's pretty nice. But if you aim for that very small hill over there, you might end up in the gutter. Even if the course is on the right level, it could be that it focuses on other things than those that you are interested in. So let's say that the course requires you to write a lot by hand, but you are not personally interested in that, and that might mean that you neglect other things you really should be doing, such as listening more or reading more. Benefit number 5 was about supportive environment for learning. And this is obviously only true if the environment actually is supportive. There are teachers who maybe don't want to teach, and there are classmates who don't behave as supportive teammates. And if you're unlucky and you end up in a class that is simply not very fun to be in and doesn't have a positive atmosphere, most of the benefits here just go out the window. Some problems also become worse the more students there are in the same class, because the teacher no longer can personalize the experience for you and needs to target the average student rather than the actual students in the class. The sixth and final benefit we looked at was credits, and here it's of course hard to argue. If you need credits, you need credits and you have to take a course. But if we look at it in more detail, there are actually very few situations where you do have to have the credits. And like I said, when you really need them, you need them. But it's not the case that you just need credits in general, or indeed that having credits is beneficial at all. Typically, people don't really care about how good your Chinese is unless it's very good and you're going to use it for something professionally. And if that's the case, they are probably going to want to verify that your Chinese is as good as you claim anyway. They might not just count on your credits being enough. Like I said before, it also depends a little bit on what the education system looks like in your country. For example, here in Sweden, if you want to teach Chinese, you have to have credits in Chinese. It doesn't matter if you're a native speaker or not, you still need the credits. So there's no way around that. You cannot take a test, you cannot do anything else. You do need the credits. And if that's the case and you want to be a teacher, well, then you have to have the credits. But for most people who just learn Chinese for some other practical reason, credits are not strictly necessary. Okay, so those were alternative ways of interpreting the same arguments, but now in favor of studying on your own. There are also some downsides with taking a course that I want to cover briefly. The first is that courses often cost money, and if you don't have money to spend, well, you cannot take a course, or this might impact your life in some other way. Even if you do have the money, you are using that to participate in an activity that might not be optimal for you. And it could be that you're better off using that money to hire, say, a private teacher to help you out with the exact things you need help with, and then you go and learn the rest on your own. There are also other tools and resources that are worth spending money on, but which might not be a course in itself. And I bring this up because even if you do have money to spend, it's not necessarily the case that taking a course is the best way to invest it. Next up is courses might clash with your schedule. You don't decide when lessons are held and you have very little influence over scheduling, pacing, and so on. Whereas if you're studying on your own, you can decide all these things on your own. How serious of a problem schedules are, of course, depends on how busy you are with other things, but it could actually preclude the possibility of taking a course entirely if you're unlucky. Naturally, courses might also be inaccessible for other reasons. They might have requirements, maybe you have to be in a university program, maybe you need to be in a specific situation in life at a certain age, or there might be numerous other restrictions that stops you from taking the best possible course. Maybe it isn't held in the city where you live and commuting is simply not possible. So I hope that these new arguments have convinced you that taking a course might not actually be the right choice for you. The truth is that it simply depends. There are many pros and cons with taking courses, and if you know about them, you should be in a better position to choose the right course, or indeed if you should take a course at all, and what you should do on your own to compensate for the things that you actually would have liked or needed in a course. A good way to compensate is to use the money you save by not taking a course and hire a private teacher for the things that you need, like I said before. Since you are already listening to my podcast, you know that there are people online who try to offer that structure to people who do study on their own, or even to people who study in a classroom but figure that that's not enough and they want to do something on their own on the side. Like we have seen, there are two factors that greatly influence your choice. The first one is your personality. If you're very extroverted and very motivated to learn and in the right environment, maybe you don't need to take a course. But if you're more the introverted kind like me, and you know that if nothing pushes you, you will actually slack off a little bit, then taking a course can be great. Finally, your level also matters a lot. If you are a beginner, there are so many things you don't know, and there are so many things you don't know that you don't know, so you actually need some kind of guidance. Because reinventing the wheel over and over is not really a good idea. When you have studied for several years, you will look back at your own learning and you will feel frustrated. Why did I do things in this way? Why didn't I do it like this instead? It would have been so much easier. And then you think, maybe I should start a website and tell other people about this. Maybe I can even call it Hacking Chinese or something. Anyway, that was an in-depth discussion of why or why not you should enroll in a Chinese course. If you've listened this far, it would be interesting to hear what you think about this. Are there any pros and cons to taking courses or maybe studying on your own that I haven't mentioned perhaps? Please head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.